California has giant human figures carved into the desert floor, so large they can only be fully seen from the sky, so precise they shouldn't exist, so old that nobody alive can tell you with certainty who made them, or why, or what they were meant to say. They were there for centuries before anyone with an airplane looked down and noticed them. And the first thing the United States military did after their discovery was drive tanks directly over them. California has a chain of stone walls running through the hills above the San Francisco Bay. 50 miles of stacked boulders, some weighing a ton, built without mortar on ridgelines so steep and inaccessible that moving them there would have been extraordinary effort for no obvious purpose. When the Spanish arrived and asked the local Ohlone people who built them, the Ohlone said the walls were already there when their ancestors came. California has an ancient village on an island 26 miles offshore, settled by people who crossed open ocean 13,000 years ago, 8,000 years before the Egyptians laid the first stone of any pyramid. And California has an archaeological site so contested that the most celebrated archaeologist of the 20th century staked his entire legacy on it, and his own wife said it destroyed his career. Most people think California's history begins with freeways, gold rushes, and film lots. But beneath the deserts, beneath the hills, beneath the floor of the Pacific just off the coastline, there is evidence of a far older world, a world of vanished cultures, unexplained monuments, and discoveries that science still cannot fully resolve. What follows is that world. The Colorado Desert in midsummer is not a comfortable place to think about ancient history. The temperature can reach 120 degrees. The air doesn't move. The desert floor, dark volcanic gravel over pale caliche, absorbs heat all morning and radiates it back all afternoon. The sky is enormous and white. The silence is total in a way that most people never encounter. A silence that has weight to it, presence. 15 miles north of Blythe, where California bleeds into Arizona and the land flattens to the horizon in every direction, 6 figures are lying on the ground. You cannot see them from where you're standing. That's the first thing to understand about the Blythe intaglios. They are not visible at ground level. You can walk across the largest of them, a human figure stretching 171 feet from head to toe, longer than a Boeing 747, without realizing you're standing on it. The outline is there, faintly, a margin of lighter soil where dark surface stones were scraped away. But the eye doesn't assemble it into a figure. The scale defeats comprehension. They were made by scraping the dark desert pavement, the patina of oxidized stones that accumulates on desert surfaces over centuries to expose the lighter soil beneath. The same technique used to create the Nazca lines in Peru. A subtractive art, not adding material, but removing it, revealing what was already there. The lines have survived because the desert is still. Wind moves slowly here. Rain is rare. What the makers left has stayed. For how long is genuinely uncertain. The dating evidence spans a 2,000-year window from around 900 BCE to 1200 CE. That range isn't a failure of technique, it reflects the nature of the material. The figures don't contain organic carbon in sufficient quantities for precise radiocarbon dating. The best estimates place their creation somewhere between 900 and 3,000 years ago. Nobody knows who made them. No Colorado River tribe claims authorship in their oral tradition, though the Mojave and Quechan peoples say the human figures represent Mastamho, the creator of life, and the animals represent Hatakulia, a mountain lion spirit. The figures exist in their cosmology. The act of creating them does not appear in their history. The desert is the same desert, same heat, same silence, same enormous sky. They begin at the edge of a planned figure and work inward or outward, following a design carried in memory. There are no drafts, no preliminary sketches in a notebook. The figure exists in someone's mind, and it is being transferred to the earth, one armful of stones at a time. The dark pavement stones are moved to the borders of the figure, piled into low berms that catch the light differently and define the edges. Hour by hour, in the heat, the figure takes shape, but only from above. One archaeologist who spent years at this site offered a thought that has stayed with me. In many indigenous traditions, he said, the making of sacred art is the ceremony. The finished object is evidence the ceremony occurred. The figures weren't messages waiting for a reader in the sky. They were the act of creation itself, the ritual completed through the communal labor of transforming the desert floor together, under the sun, in the heat, for as long as it took. That interpretation is grounded and compelling. It resolves the question of the aerial view. The figures look like figures from above because figures at that scale necessarily do. The makers weren't designing for altitude. They were participating in something that happened to leave a monumental trace. That may be exactly right. It doesn't fully dissolve the strangeness of standing here and looking at your phone's satellite view. November 12th, 1932. Army Air Corps pilot George Palmer is on a routine flight from the Hoover Dam region toward Los Angeles. The route takes him over the Colorado desert at altitude. He looks down. On the desert floor below him, shapes. Not random, not geological. Human in outline, spread across two mesas, clear and deliberate against the dark gravel. Palmer made note. He told people. He brought others back to confirm what he'd seen. The figures had been there for centuries, possibly for 3,000 years. In all that time, nobody with the ability to recognize them from above had looked down at the right moment. Or if they had, the observation hadn't survived. The figures were known by the people of the river. They simply hadn't been noticed by anyone who would write them into a record that reached the wider world. What happened next is one of the more uncomfortable passages in California's archaeological history. Within a decade of Palmer's discovery, General George Patton selected the Colorado Desert for training maneuvers in preparation for the North African campaign of World War II. His tanks needed terrain resembling the Sahara. The desert outside Blythe fit the requirement perfectly. The tanks drove over the intaglios, not because the military didn't know they were there. By 1942, the figures had received some coverage in newspapers and magazines. But the calculus of wartime training outweighed the preservation of ancient art. The vehicles crossed the mesas. The lines were disturbed. Track marks were pressed into the desert floor beside patterns that had survived intact for 1,000 years. By the time National Geographic and the Smithsonian sent a formal team in 1952, the scars were visible in photographs. Protective fencing finally went up in 1974. 42 years after discovery. The fences are there now. The figures are protected. The tank tracks are still in the photographs from 1952, a permanent record of what happens when the present doesn't know, or doesn't care, what it's walking on. The East Bay Hills run along the eastern edge of the San Francisco Bay in a long ridge. Fremont, Hayward, Oakland, Berkeley, and beyond. The hills rising 1,000 feet or more above the flatlands and continuing north for 50 miles toward Mount Diablo and past it. On a clear morning, the view from the ridge above Mission Peak takes in the entire South Bay, the geometry of suburbs, the blue stripe of the bay itself, the white haze above San Jose, where 100 companies are doing the work that runs the modern world. It's a view that makes you feel as though civilization is very recent and very efficient. Everything below is optimized. Everything is moving. And then you notice the wall. It's there at the trail's edge, if you're looking. A line of boulders stacked without mortar, rising in places to chest height, following the ridgeline north. Some of the stones are close to a ton. They didn't arrive here by accident. Moving them to this ridge, across terrain that challenges a fit hiker traveling light, required people effort, organization, and time. For what purpose is the question that nobody has answered in 130 years of asking. The East Bay Mystery Walls stretch over 50 documented miles through these hills. The oldest published account appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle in March 1896, when a surveyor noticed something anomalous on a ridge above Oakland and wrote it up. The walls had presumably been there long before that. The surveyor didn't build them, he just noticed them. When the Spanish colonists arrived in the Bay Area in the late 18th century, they asked the Ohlone people about the walls. The Ohlone said they hadn't built them. They didn't know who had. The walls were there when their own ancestors arrived. That testimony matters. The Ohlone were here for thousands of years. They watched the seasons and the ridgelines. They knew their landscape in the intimate, generational way of people who have no reason to treat the land as abstract. If the walls had been built within the scope of their cultural memory, they would have known it. The Ohlone said they didn't know. Later, theories filled the vacuum with varying degrees of confidence. A UC Berkeley professor in 1904 declared the walls were built by Chinese immigrants, reasoning, with the breezy certainty of a different era, that Chinese laborers were naturally inclined to wall building. The theory had no supporting evidence. Others proposed a vanished pre-Columbian civilization of advanced indigenous people who built stone architecture and then disappeared. Near Mount Diablo, the walls connect to stone circles up to 30 feet in diameter. In one location, a section of wall spirals 200 feet wide around a central boulder. The walls may have been built across multiple periods by different people, some ancient, some recent, accumulated over time in layers that resist any unified explanation. The lichen dating may be accurately measuring the most recent construction while entirely missing older sections beneath. Or the Ohlone's account was mistaken. Or the walls were built just before their own arrival by a culture that left no other trace. The honest answer is that nobody knows. The funding for comprehensive study has never materialized, and the walls continue their 50-mile journey through the hills above one of the most technologically sophisticated regions in human history, mostly unexamined, mostly unnoticed. Most hikers walk right past them. The trail signs don't mention them. The fog comes in off the bay some mornings and lies in the valleys while the ridgeline stays clear. Stand in the right place and the world below you disappears into white. The wall runs ahead into the mist, the next boulder, and the next, fading into grey. Nobody put a marker here. Nobody built an interpretive sign. The most visited hiking area in the East Bay, and the most enduring unsolved mystery of the Bay Area archaeology, is just there, at the edge of the trail, every weekend, waiting for someone to stop and ask. In the Sierra Nevada foothills east of Sacramento, in a state park that most people drive past without stopping, there is a flat limestone outcrop 173 feet long. Its surface contains 1,185 mortar cups, 363 petroglyphs, the largest concentration of bedrock mortars anywhere in North America, on one rock. The northern Sierra Miwok used this place for generations to grind acorns into flour. That much is settled. The site is called chores, and the practical function of the mortars, the daily labor of food preparation, is not in doubt. What nobody has explained is why this rock, the Sierra foothills, contain thousands of limestone outcrops. Any of them would have served the same practical purpose. And yet, across a span measured in thousands of years, people returned to this one specific stone. The mortar cups range from shallow depressions to bowls worn 12 inches deep. If each required even a modest estimate of accumulated use, the rock represents over 100,000 hours of labor, 13 years of continuous grinding, compressed into a single surface. Something drew people here that wasn't only practicality. The petroglyphs, spirals, animal tracks, human figures, symbols without agreed interpretation, suggest this place held meaning beyond meal preparation. Perhaps the act of returning to the communal stone was itself the point. connection to ancestors who had ground at the same place, participation in something that accumulated across generations. That's a reasonable theory. What it doesn't change is the fact of the rock, worn into, added to, returned to, for thousands of years, for reasons that did not survive in any form we can read. The Mojave Desert, northeast of Barstow, is a place of geological patience. The hills here are old in the way that only desert hills are old, stripped of topsoil, worn to their mineral cores, exposed by a dryness that preserves even as it erodes. The sediment layers in the hillsides record time in stripes of rust and ochre and grey, each band a different epoch. In a hillside near Calico, 15 miles from Barstow, some of that sediment is 200,000 years old. This is where Louis Leakey came in 1963. Leakey arrived in California at the height of his fame. He had spent decades in the Olduvai Gorge of Tanzania, excavating the remains of human ancestors that pushed the known timeline of our species back by millions of years. He had been right when the scientific establishment said he was wrong. He had the scars and the credentials of someone who had staked his name on difficult claims and won. What he saw at Calico were stones embedded in the ancient sediment that looked, to his trained eye, like tools. Not finished, refined tools, crude ones. Choppers and scrapers, the rough beginnings of human toolmaking, the kind of objects he had spent a career learning to recognize. If the stones were tools, if human hands had shaped them, then people had been in California 20 times earlier than any accepted timeline. Leakey began excavating in 1964 with the backing of the San Bernardino County Museum. He returned repeatedly, supervising the work personally for years. Over 11,000 stone specimens were eventually recovered. The documentation was meticulous. The methodology was, by the standards of the time, careful, and the mainstream archaeological community rejected the claim. The objection came primarily from geologists. Vance Haynes, a specialist in sediment analysis, argued that the fracture patterns on the Calico stones were consistent with natural geological processes, with the pressure and movement of sediment, with stones striking other stones, with water and freeze-thaw cycles working on rock over tens of thousands of years. The objects were not tools, he argued. They were geofacts. Both sides commissioned tests. Researchers dropped 50-pound boulders onto rock samples, ran specimens through an 8-ton road roller, fed them through mechanical crushers. The goal was to produce natural fracture patterns indistinguishable from the Calico stones, to prove that geology alone could create the same objects. They couldn't do it, not convincingly. But that wasn't proof the stones were tools either. It meant only that the specific fractures hadn't been replicated under controlled conditions. The absence of replication isn't the same as confirmation. Leakey kept returning to the site. He was in his 70s, his health declining, his wife increasingly dismayed by what she saw happening to his reputation. Mary Leakey, who had made her own extraordinary contributions to paleoanthropology, whose name stood as firmly as his in the history of the field, wrote in her memoir that Calico had been catastrophic for Lewis's career, that the site, whatever its true nature, had cost him something he couldn't recover. He died in October 1972. He had been defending Calico for 9 years. Think about the psychology of that. A man who had been right about Africa when everyone said he was wrong, who had developed an almost physical intuition for the evidence of ancient human presence, spending his final decade in a Mojave desert hillside that his own wife believed was destroying him. Either Leakey's instincts had finally led him somewhere they shouldn't have gone, or he was standing on a discovery that the field wasn't equipped to accept, and he knew it, and he kept going anyway, because that's what he had always done. The site closed in 2016 due to vandalism. It reopened in March 2023. The dig is still active, the oldest continuously running archaeological excavation in the United States. Volunteers still work the site on weekends. The hillside is still being carefully removed, layer by layer, in the patient way Leakey trained them. The stones haven't been definitively classified. After 60 years, either humans were in California 200,000 years ago, which would rewrite the entire story of human migration across the planet, or one of the most decorated scientists of the 20th century spent his final years being fooled by rocks. Both of those things remain possible. Neither has been ruled out. The hillside doesn't offer an opinion. The Santa Barbara Channel at night is nothing like it looks from the shore in daylight. During the day, from the Ventura coast, the Channel Islands are a comfortable presence on the horizon. Low grey shapes, familiar, settled into the distance. They seem close. They seem manageable. At night, crossing open water in the dark, 26 miles of Pacific between you and land, the situation is different. The water temperature in the Santa Barbara Channel averages around 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold enough in the water to be dangerous within hours. The currents run unpredictably, shaped by the channel's complex underwater topography. Fog moves in without warning and can reduce visibility to a few feet. Swells build in winter and can reach 8, 10, 12 feet in the open channel. There is no shallow crossing, no gradual narrowing where you might wade between shore and island. The channel is deep, over 600 feet in places, and it was deep 13,000 years ago, when the glaciers were still retreating from North America, and the sea level was lower but not low enough to close this gap. Someone crossed it anyway. In 1959, archaeologist Phil Orr excavated human femur bones from a bluff on Santa Rosa Island, the remains of a woman, approximately 13,000 years old. She is known as Arlington Springs Woman, and she is among the oldest human remains ever found in North America. She was on the island. That fact is not a theory. It's not an interpretation. Arlington Springs Woman was there, her bones in the island's earth, 13,000 years ago, which means people were building watercraft capable of open ocean navigation in California at a time when the last of the great ice sheets were still retreating from the northern continent. The Channel Islands contain hundreds of ancient sites. On Santa Rosa and San Miguel, massive shell mounds rise from the landscape, 15 feet deep in places, covering acres, representing thousands of years of accumulated daily life compressed into the earth. Layer upon layer of discarded shellfish, animal bone, charcoal, stone tools, and eventually human remains. Not a dump in any modern sense, an archive. Each layer a season, a generation, a century of people who lived here and ate and worked and died. Some of these mounds are hillsides now. You can stand on what appears to be a natural slope and be standing on the accumulated material of 3,000 years of meals. In 2005, the Toucan Man skeleton was recovered from San Miguel Island. He was approximately 10,000 years old. Analysis of his bones showed the specific isotopic signature of a marine diet, a lifetime sustained by the ocean. He wasn't a visitor or a stranded castaway. He was someone who belonged to the sea in the way that people who have fished the same waters for generations belong to it, with a knowledge accumulated across more lifetimes than can be counted. But here is the thing that the archaeology cannot show us, no matter how carefully the sites are excavated. The boats, the vessels that carried the first people across those 26 miles of open Pacific, have never been found. Not a plank, not a rib, not a fragment of lashing. The boats were made of organic materials, wood, tule reeds, animal hide, and they decomposed completely. The ocean and time took them apart and absorbed them and left nothing. We know the boats existed because the people are on the islands. That's the only evidence, and it's conclusive in its way. You cannot argue with a 13,000-year-old skeleton on an island separated from the mainland by open ocean. The boats were real. They worked. They carried people across water that would be challenging to cross today in a modern vessel with a motor and a GPS and a Coast Guard on alert. Imagine what that crossing looked like. A coast you've known all your life, receding behind you. the mainland shrinking into the grey of early morning, the islands visible ahead, or not visible if the fog is thick, a destination held in memory, in story, in the knowledge passed down from whoever made the first crossing before you. The water around you is cold. The current is pushing sideways. The vessel moves with the swells, rising and falling. The ocean doesn't care about the significance of what's happening. It just moves. And then, slowly, the island grows on the horizon. The dark shape firms up, gains detail. Cliffs, then vegetation, then the specific geography of a familiar shore. You've been paddling for hours. The current has pushed you further south than you intended. You correct. The landing is not where you planned, but it's possible. And you make for it. Someone on the shore sees you coming. The boats that made all of this possible are gone so completely that we cannot even reconstruct what they looked like with confidence. The plank canoe, the tomol, is documented in Chumash culture in the historical period, sophisticated and watertight, capable of extended ocean voyages. Whether something similar existed 13,000 years ago, or whether the first crossings used simpler reed craft, is unknown. What we have is the destination, the bones in the island's earth, the shell mounds that took thousands of years to accumulate, the evidence of a maritime culture so old it predates agriculture in most of the world. The oldest evidence of sophisticated human presence in California can only be reached by water. The water is still there. The boats are not. That gap, between the crossing we know happened and the vessel we cannot find, contains one of the deepest mysteries in the archaeology of the continent. There is a narrow road above Santa Barbara that climbs steeply into the Santa Ynez Mountains. It's barely wide enough for 2 cars, and the drop-off on one side discourages inattention. Parking at the top fits perhaps 2 vehicles. On a clear day, looking south, the Pacific is visible in the distance, grey-blue and enormous, running to a horizon that curves with the earth. At the end of this road is a small sandstone cave. The Chumash called it Alaxalaxan. The approach is part of the meaning. This was not a public place. The cave sits at the end of a difficult road that discourages casual visitors, on a hillside that offers concealment rather than visibility. It was chosen for its hiddenness. The people who painted here were not making something to be seen widely. They were making something that belonged to a specific tradition, used by specific practitioners, in the context of ceremonies whose full details were meant to remain within the society that held them. Inside, the cave is small, intimate in the way that important places often are. The ceiling is low enough that a person of average height must be careful. The walls are covered with polychrome paintings, red, white, black, applied over time in layers that suggest the cave was used repeatedly across generations. Human figures with outstretched arms, geometric patterns that recur in Chumash ceremonial art, celestial designs, banded centipede forms that appear in the religious iconography of the Antap, the astronomer priests, the spiritual elite of the Chumash people. The Antap were not casual practitioners. They were specialists in the movements of the sky, maintainers of a ceremonial calendar tied to solar and stellar events, keepers of a cosmological knowledge that required years of training to acquire. They observed the sun's path through the year with enough precision to design structures that tracked it. They held the knowledge of when the seasons turned. And in this cave, they may have recorded one specific moment in the sky. The most studied painting in Alaxalaxan shows a black disk surrounded by radiating lines. The visual grammar of that image, in any tradition, in any culture, is the grammar of a total solar eclipse. The corona, the moment when the moon covers the sun and the sky goes dark at midday and the stars briefly appear and the temperature drops and the world becomes strange. Researchers have proposed that this painting corresponds to the total solar eclipse of November 24th, 1677. A shaman stood somewhere on the southern California coast in November of 1677, watched the sky go dark at midday and carried the image of what they saw back to this hidden cave and pressed it into the stone wall with red and black pigment. The painting is still on the wall, 350 years later. The tradition that produced it did not survive intact. The Spanish mission system, beginning in 1769, brought the coastal Chumash into a world of forced labor, epidemic disease, and the systematic replacement of indigenous culture with colonial religion. Populations that had numbered in the tens of thousands collapsed within decades. Languages lost speakers. The Antap society dissolved. The ceremonial calendar was disrupted. The knowledge carried by the astronomer priests, the full meaning of specific symbols, the ritual context for the paintings, the layers of interpretation that a trained practitioner would have brought to this cave, died with the people who held it. What remains is the painting, the image of the eclipse, the black disk on the cave wall, surrounded by radiating lines, recording a moment in the sky that happened 3.5 centuries ago and will not be forgotten as long as the pigment holds. A heavy iron gate now closes the cave entrance. It's necessary. Visitors scratched their names into the paintings before anyone thought to stop them, and camera flashes degraded pigments that had survived the centuries intact. The gate arrived late, but it arrived. You can still visit. The road is public. You peer through the bars at paintings that were never meant for you to see, in a cave that was chosen for its secrecy. In the Simi Hills of Ventura County, a hillside has managed to accumulate one of the stranger histories in California, a collision of ancient and modern that no one planned and no one entirely knows what to do with. The Chumash Rock Art Cave at Burrow Flats contains elaborate paintings, geometric patterns, anthropomorphic figures, celestial designs in red, black, and white. Research indicates the cave was deliberately oriented so that sunlight enters at the winter solstice and illuminates specific paintings. An astronomical observatory built not with lenses and instruments, but with the geometry of a cave mouth and the movement of the sun. The winter solstice is the pivot of the year, the moment the sun stops retreating south and begins its return. For cultures that tracked the sky, and the Chumash, through their Antap priests, tracked it with precision, the solstice was a ceremony-worthy event, the kind of moment that justified architectural effort. The Antap built that effort into this hillside, roughly 1,000 years ago. The same hillside, beginning in 1947, became part of the Santa Susana Field Laboratory, where the Rocketdyne Corporation tested nuclear reactors and rocket engines for the space and defense programs of the Cold War. A partial nuclear meltdown occurred here in 1959, one of the larger nuclear accidents in American history, less well known than 3 Mile Island or Chernobyl, but significant. The site was restricted and has remained restricted ever since. The cave has been inaccessible to the public for nearly 80 years, not because of any decision about the cave, but because the cave is inside a fence around a contaminated former nuclear facility. Ancient solstice astronomy and Cold War nuclear physics on the same ground. Both, in their different vocabularies, reaching toward fundamental forces. One using shadow and pigment and the patient observation of the sky over generations. The other, splitting atoms. The cave is still there. The fence is still there. Near the Oregon border, in the volcanic northeast of California, a basalt cliff face rises above what was once a shoreline. Over 5,000 individual carvings cover the rock, one of the most concentrated petroglyph panels in North America, made by ancestors of the Modoc people across centuries of sustained work. Complex geometric patterns, animal-formed, the cliff overlooks the former bed of Tule Lake. When the carvings were made, the lake extended to the base of the cliff. The artists worked at the water's edge. People arriving by boat would have seen the carvings above them, reflected in the surface below. The lake was drained for agriculture in the early 20th century. The water was gone within a few years. Picture what was lost in that draining. The carvings were designed for a specific context. The approach by water, the reflection, the orientation of arrival. The lake wasn't incidental to the carvings. The lake was part of how the carvings worked. Now the rock face looks out over dry farmland. The reflections are gone. The approach by water is impossible. The 5,000 symbols carved into the basalt by generations of artists who understood this place as a lakeside cliff are now hanging above a field, speaking their ancient language into empty air. The theatre was drained. The audience was a landscape, and the landscape was removed. West of Hemet, in Riverside County, protected by 2 chain-link fences on a boulder in a quiet canyon, is a carving that has no satisfying explanation. The Hemet Maze Stone, a 46-inch square petroglyph, an intricate labyrinth formed by interlocking shapes that consistently remind researchers of Buddhist art more than any known Native American tradition in Southern California. The stone was rediscovered by a rancher in 1914. Since then, approximately 50 similar carvings have been found within a 150-mile radius. That is the entire physical record. 50 carvings, one consistent style, one region, and nothing else. No associated settlements, no pottery, no tools, no burials, just the carvings, distributed across the inland desert, repeating a motif that doesn't match its surroundings. One theory proposes Chinese Buddhist monks who reached California around 500 AD, possibly survivors of a wreck, possibly intentional voyagers, and left their visual vocabulary in the rock before disappearing. Proponents point to the Palos Verdes stone anchors and to 5th century Chinese records of monks sailing east into the Pacific. The mainstream view leans toward an unknown indigenous culture, the Rancho Bernardo style, whose identity is simply unrecorded. Neither explanation has proof. In the 1930s, someone vandalized the stone, carving a Nazi swastika onto its corner. They didn't recognize that the original design was a variation of the same ancient symbol, present in Hindu, Buddhist, Hopi, and Navajo traditions for thousands of years as a mark of renewal and cyclical life. The modern hate symbol was pressed onto an ancient spiritual form by someone who couldn't tell the difference. The stone is behind 2 fences now. The vandal's mark is still there. The original carving is still there, older and stranger and more patient than the damage done to it. Off the Palos Verdes Peninsula in Los Angeles County, between 30 and 80 feet below the surface, scattered across a few miles of seafloor, more than 30 large donut-shaped stones. They don't belong there. The stone they're made from is not native to the Palos Verdes area. They were brought here deliberately from somewhere else. Divers documented them in the 1970s and 1980s. The shape is consistent with stone anchors used on traditional Chinese vessels for centuries. The similarity is specific enough to be notable. 2 explanations divide the debate. The first reaches back to the early 15th century and Admiral Zheng He's fleet, the largest the world had seen, on routes that may have extended across the Pacific. If Chinese vessels reached California around 1421, these could be their anchors, and the Hemet Maze Stone's Buddhist-adjacent imagery would fit the same narrative. The second is more grounded. Chinese fishermen were extensively documented off the California coast from the 1850s through the early 20th century, and they used stone anchors. The stones could be 150 years old. The question is answerable. Geological analysis of the stone could establish its source. That analysis has never been definitively conducted. 30 stones on the floor of the Pacific off Los Angeles. The technology to date them has existed for decades. The answer is there, physically, 60 feet underwater. It's waiting. In the Carrizo Plain, a broad flat basin in San Luis Obispo County, one of the last intact grassland ecosystems in California, a massive horseshoe of sandstone rises 55 feet from the valley floor. Painted rock. Its interior walls form a natural amphitheater. Stand at the center and speak, and the stone returns your words in layers, overlapping, as if the rock is answering. Whether the people who came here thousands of years ago chose this place for its acoustics, or whether that quality was incidental to something else they found here, is unknown. The pictographs on these walls span at least 4,000 years. Red, white, and black pigments, added across centuries, made by the Chumash, the Yokuts, and the Salinan. Three distinct peoples with different languages and traditions, all drawn to this specific formation across millennia. The abstract images resist interpretation. Painted rock is open to public guided tours from March through May only. The pictographs are vulnerable to sunlight and contact. The rest of the year, the gate is locked. You need a reservation to see 4,000-year-old paintings. That sentence is worth sitting with. Near Needles, along the Colorado River where California meets Arizona, is a site that has been studied for over a century and remains genuinely unresolved. The Topok Maze, 18 acres, roughly 14 football fields, of scraped earth arranged in parallel windrows, creating a pattern that from above resembles a labyrinth. The technique is identical to the Blythe intaglios, scraping away surface stone to expose lighter soil. Nobody agrees on who made it or when. The Mojave people, who live nearest to it, do not claim it in their oral tradition. Ancient trails in the surrounding desert stop at the maze's edges rather than crossing them, suggesting the maze was created after the trails, which implies it's relatively recent. But the design is elaborate and intentional, consistent with ceremonial labyrinths found in cultures across the world. And then there's the other theory, 19th century railroad workers harvesting gravel. After more than 100 years of study, the debate between sacred labyrinth and industrial gravel pit remains genuinely open. Both interpretations have supporting evidence. Neither has proof. 18 acres of scraped desert, a question that may never be answered. Sometimes the evidence isn't insufficient. It's simply gone. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more deep dives and mysterious stories.